Imagine waking up, trapped in complete darkness, your own coffin pressing down on you, with nothing but dirt and silence around. Sounds impossible, right? But terrifyingly real cases exist. People who were buried alive, struggling for every breath, leaving behind screams that still haunt us today. In this video, we dive into 10 chilling true stories of premature burial, each one more horrifying than the last. Stay with us, if you dare. And before the nightmare begins, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the most bone-chilling stories we uncover. Charleston, South Carolina, 1871. The summer air was heavy, thick with humidity, and the sound of horse-drawn carriages clattered against the cobblestone streets. In the small but respected McAllister household, tragedy had struck. Margaret, a 23-year-old woman known for her striking auburn hair and quiet laughter, had collapsed suddenly after days of fever. The family physician examined her pale body, checked her faint breath once, pressed his hand to her chest, and solemnly declared, "She is gone." The household erupted in grief. In the 19th century, medical tools were crude, and death was often assumed with nothing more than a shallow breath overlooked. Margaret's mother begged for them to wait, begged for more time, but the physician insisted that the disease was dangerous, and the body must be buried quickly to prevent contagion. By dusk, the funeral was arranged. The coffin was closed after only a few short prayers. The soil swallowed Margaret into silence. But silence does not last forever. On the second night after her burial, the family servant, a superstitious woman from the countryside, woke to a faint sound outside the window. At first, she thought it was the restless creak of tree branches. Then it came again, a dull thud. Then another, slow, rhythmic, from the cemetery across the road. Terrified, she told the McAllisters. The family dismissed it as grief playing tricks. But when the sound grew louder, bang, bang, the father could no longer ignore it. With lanterns trembling in their hands, they rushed to the cemetery and stood frozen at Margaret's grave. The earth seemed to shift ever so slightly. Panicked, they ordered the coffin to be dug up. The wood creaked as nails were pried loose. And then the horror revealed itself. Inside the coffin, Margaret's once beautiful face was contorted into a scream. Her fingers were shredded, nails broken down to bloody stubs from clawing at the lid. Her hair was matted with sweat, her dress torn apart. The marks inside the coffin told the truth. Margaret had woken beneath the earth, suffocating in the dark, fighting until her final breath. The townspeople whispered for years after that night. Some said they still heard scratching from her grave long after she was reburied. Others swore Margaret's restless spirit haunted the streets of Charleston, her screams forever echoing in the heavy southern air. New Orleans, 1914, the city of the dead. That's what people called the famous cemeteries of Louisiana. Endless rows of whitewashed crypts stacked above ground, rising like miniature marble houses. The air there was always thick, carrying the smell of damp earth, moss, and something faintly metallic. Locals said the cemeteries were alive at night, whispering secrets in the humid southern darkness. One summer, in the French Quarter, mourners gathered to lay a wealthy merchant, Charles Duval, to rest. He had collapsed suddenly at a dinner party, his face turning purple, his breath vanishing before anyone could react. The doctor pronounced him dead within minutes. The family, eager to honor tradition, sealed him quickly into the family crypt, a massive marble vault with heavy iron doors. Days passed, but then the rumors began. The groundskeeper, an old Creole man named Etienne, swore he heard muffled cries when he passed the Duval tomb at night. At first, he tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the sounds grew clearer, pleading, frantic, desperate. Something inside was moving. Etienne told the family, but they laughed in his face, insisting grief and bourbon had clouded his mind. But Etienne wasn't the only one. Visitors began to whisper about strange noises, scratching, pounding, faint gasps that echoed through the stone corridors of the cemetery. One woman swore she heard a man screaming her name when she walked past. Fear spread quickly. No one wanted to linger near the Duval crypt after sunset. Finally, after weeks of complaints, the city ordered the tomb opened. What they found made even the hardest man in New Orleans turn pale. Inside the marble chamber, the coffin was shoved sideways, almost toppled. Its lid had been beaten so violently from the inside that the wood had splintered in multiple places. They pried it open, and horror spilled out. Charles Duval was not lying peacefully. His body had shifted violently, his face frozen in a mask of pure terror, mouth stretched unnaturally wide, teeth shattered. His fingers were bloody stumps where nails had been ripped off clawing the coffin. His chest was bruised from slamming against the lid. He had woken after burial and fought until the very last breath. The family was horrified. They tried to silence the rumors, but word spread fast through the quarter. People began to whisper that Duval's soul was restless, that his screams could still be heard when the moon was high. Some swore the marble crypt echoed with faint pounding at midnight, as if Charles still begged to be released. The Duval tomb still stands today, a silent sentinel among the other graves. Tourists pass it every day on guided ghost tours, not realizing the chilling truth buried beneath. But locals know. They say if you lean too close to the iron door on a quiet summer night, you'll hear its fingernails dragging against wood, and a scream that never found its end. Pennsylvania, 1882. The fear of premature burial was so common in the 19th century that it birthed a strange invention, the safety coffin. A coffin with a thin rope tied to the corpse's hand, running through a small pipe up to the surface, where it connected to a bell mounted on a metal pole. If the dead happened to wake, they could tug the rope and ring the bell to summon help. Families believed this would save them from the unthinkable fate of being buried alive. But what happens when the bell rings and no one comes in time? In a quiet rural town, a young man named Samuel Peters had fallen ill from a sudden fever. His skin turned gray, his breath shallow. After days of agony, the doctor declared him dead. Samuel's parents, terrified of burying him too soon, paid extra for the newest coffin design, the safety coffin. They buried him in the churchyard, the small bell gleaming in the moonlight above his grave. For 2 days, nothing happened. The town moved on. Then, on the third night, as the clock struck midnight, the bell rang. At first, the watchman thought it was the wind, but then it rang again, loud, frantic, desperate. The sound echoed through the cemetery, clanging wildly in the silence. The watchman panicked, sprinted to the church, and banged on the priest's door. Within minutes, a group of townsfolk had gathered around the grave. The bell was ringing so violently that the rope looked ready to snap. "God help us," one woman whispered. "He's alive." They dug with shaking hands, shovels slicing through dirt. The bell clanged above their heads, faster, louder. The ground seemed to pulse with urgency, as if Samuel himself clawed upward. Finally, they reached the coffin. The wood was damp with soil. They pried the lid open. The sight inside froze every soul in place. Samuel was indeed alive, but barely. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips shredded from screaming. His fingers were raw and bloody from pulling the rope so hard. His chest heaved shallowly as he gasped for air. But the cruelest horror, the rope that should have saved him had cut deep into his wrist, leaving bloody grooves. He had pulled until his skin tore apart. Before anyone could react, Samuel let out a final rattling breath. His body went still, his head slumping sideways. He had fought for hours, even days, to survive beneath the earth. But rescue had come just minutes too late. The graveyard fell silent. Then, in a sick twist of irony, the bell above the grave gave one final ring, and stopped forever. For years afterward, the townspeople swore they sometimes heard the sound of that bell in the dead of night, even though the safety coffin had been dismantled. They avoided the cemetery after dusk, whispering that Samuel's spirit was still tugging on the rope, forever ringing for a help that never truly came. Virginia, 1897. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Clara Hastings, only 19 years old, walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Church in a white silk gown imported from France. Her cheeks glowed, her veil shimmered under candlelight, and her fiancé, Thomas, stood waiting with tears in his eyes. Guests whispered about how radiant she looked, how perfect the couple seemed. But fate is cruel. Halfway through the ceremony, Clara's face drained of color. Her lips trembled, her body swayed, and before anyone could react, she collapsed onto the stone floor. Panic erupted. The priest rushed to her side. The town physician pushed through the crowd, checked her pulse, listened for breath, and shook his head. She's gone. The church fell into a suffocating silence. Thomas wept over her lifeless body, clutching her cold hand, begging her to wake. But medicine in the 19th century was far from precise. A faint, shallow breath could easily be missed. Clara was declared dead on the spot, her wedding transforming instantly into a funeral. Her grieving family decided to bury her in the very gown she had worn, as if she would continue her journey as a bride in the afterlife. The white dress, the veil, even the bouquet of roses still clenched in her hands, went into the coffin. The grave was dug before nightfall. Days passed. Then, late one evening, the cemetery groundskeeper, an old war veteran named Silas, was making his usual rounds when he froze. The moonlight was pale, the air still, and yet, he swore he heard it, a sound that curdled his blood. Soft sobbing. It came from the fresh earth of Clara Hastings' grave. At first, Silas thought his mind was playing tricks, but then the sound grew louder, muffled cries, fists pounding against wood, a voice breaking in terror. He dropped his lantern and ran to the village, screaming that the bride was still alive. By the time help arrived and the coffin was dug up, it was too late. They pried the lid open, and the sight inside haunted every witness until their dying day. Clara's once beautiful gown was shredded, the delicate lace torn apart by frantic hands. Her veil was twisted around her neck, her hair matted with sweat. Her bouquet was crushed, petals scattered, and stained with blood. Her fingernails were broken, her fingertips raw from clawing at the coffin walls. Her mouth was wide open in a silent scream, her jaw broken from the force of trying to cry out. Her eyes, glassy and frozen in terror, stared upward at the lid. She could never escape. The town buried her again, this time in silence. No prayers, no hymns, just dread. People avoided the cemetery for months afterward, whispering that Clara's spirit wandered in her wedding dress, searching for the day she was promised but never received. Some swore they saw a pale figure in white drifting between the gravestones, her sobs carried on the wind. To this day, locals call her grave the Bride's Rest, and those brave or foolish enough to walk past it at midnight claim they hear faint knocking from below. They ask if she is still trying to finish her vows. Texas, 1963. The car accident had been brutal. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and the mangled wreck of a Ford Thunderbird lay on the side of a rural highway outside Dallas. Inside, 26-year-old Evelyn Parker was pulled from the wreckage. Her body was limp, her skin pale, her pulse faint. At the small-town hospital, with limited equipment and chaotic staff, the young doctor placed a stethoscope to her chest, waited a few seconds, and shook his head. She didn't make it. Her family was devastated. Evelyn was young, vibrant, known for her laughter and her love of music. The suddenness of her death made it even harder to bear. The doctor signed the death certificate, and her body was released for burial within hours. In their grief, no one questioned the diagnosis. Her funeral was arranged quickly. The coffin simple oak box was lowered into the dry Texas soil the next afternoon. Mourners cried as the sun set. The pastor spoke of God's will, and the ground swallowed Evelyn whole. But not everyone left the cemetery that night. The grave digger, a weathered man named Hank, remained behind, finishing his work. As the last shovelful of dirt settled, he leaned on his spade and lit a cigarette. That's when he heard it. Thump. He froze. It came again, a dull, hollow sound, muffled beneath the earth. Hank's cigarette fell from his lips. His heart pounded in his chest. He leaned closer. Thump, thump, scratch. It was coming from Evelyn Parker's grave. He stumbled backward, whispering, "No, no, dear God." Then louder, "She's alive. She's alive down there." But when Hank rushed to the Parker family's home in the dead of night, banging on their door and shouting the terrible news, no one believed him. They thought grief and whiskey had clouded his senses. The pastor silenced him with cold words. "She is gone, Hank. Let her rest." Hank insisted, begged, but no one came. By the next morning, the grave was left untouched. The thumping, the scratching, if it continued, was silenced beneath 6 feet of soil. Decades later, in the 1990s, the cemetery was relocated to make room for new construction. Workers unearthed Evelyn's coffin. When they pried it open, the sight was enough to make grown men vomit. Evelyn's body had shifted violently. She was no longer lying on her back, but twisted onto her side. Her face was frozen in a rictus of horror, her mouth wide open, teeth shattered. Her fingers were bloodied stumps, bones exposed where she had clawed at the wooden lid until her flesh tore apart. The inside of the coffin was scarred with deep grooves, proof of a desperate struggle. The truth was undeniable. Evelyn Parker had been buried alive. The story spread like wildfire through the town. Hank, long dead by then, was remembered as the man who tried to save her but was silenced by disbelief. The Parker family never spoke of it publicly, but locals say Evelyn never left. They claim that on quiet nights, if you stand near the old relocated graves, you can hear faint scratching beneath the earth, and sometimes the hollow thud of a woman's fists begging to be let out. Kentucky, 1921. The fire had started just after midnight. A lantern tipped over in the Hastings family home, flames leaping across dry wooden beams. By the time neighbors rushed to help, the entire farmhouse was engulfed. When the fire finally died, nothing was left but ash, charred beams, and the bodies of the Hastings family father, mother, and their 3 children huddled together in the ruins. The town mourned deeply. The Hastings were well loved, known for their generosity and kindness. With no coffins prepared for such a sudden tragedy, the town elders decided to entomb the entire family in a single stone vault on the edge of the cemetery. The bodies, scorched but intact, were laid side by side inside a heavy iron-lined chamber. The vault was sealed with a thick slab of limestone, cemented into place. Prayers were spoken, hymns were sung, and the family was left to rest together in silence. Or so they thought. 2 nights later, the cemetery watchman, a veteran of the Great War named Joseph, was making his rounds when he froze. The moon was high, the air unnaturally still. From the direction of the Hastings vault came a sound that turned his blood cold. Knock. He held his lantern higher. Again knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, echoing against the stone. Then came something worse, scratching. A faint, frantic scraping from deep inside the vault. Joseph's hand shook so badly, he nearly dropped the lantern. He backed away, whispering prayers, before running into town to wake the minister. By dawn, the story had spread. The Hastings family wasn't at peace. The townspeople argued. Some insisted they open the vault immediately. Others warned that disturbing the dead would bring a curse. The minister, pale and trembling, declared it a trick of grief and forbade the vault to be touched. Out of fear or perhaps guilt, the town obeyed. But the noises didn't stop. For weeks afterward, mourners visiting other graves swore they heard muffled pounding beneath the stone slab. Some claimed they heard faint cries, a woman's voice calling out, a child whimpering in the dark. Farmers passing at night avoided the cemetery altogether, crossing themselves when the wind carried the echoes of fists against stone. Eventually, the sounds faded. The vault grew silent once more. Years later, when a storm split open part of the cemetery, curious boys dared to peek into a crack in the Hastings vault. What they saw inside was enough to haunt them for life. The bodies were no longer laid side by side in peaceful rest. They were twisted, sprawled in unnatural positions. The mother's arms were stretched toward the vault door. The father's fists were bloodied, bones jutting from his hands as if he had beaten the stone until they broke. The children were huddled in the corner, mouths open in frozen screams. The vault was resealed, this time with iron chains. The town stopped speaking of the Hastings family altogether. Yet to this day, locals call it the Vault of Echoes, and those who dare walk past it after midnight whisper they still hear it faint knocking from beneath the stone, the eternal struggle of a family that never truly escaped the fire. Ohio, 1934. The Turner family was no stranger to hardship. The Great Depression had left their small town in poverty, and when their youngest daughter, Mary, fell gravely ill, there was little they could do. At just 16 years old, Mary collapsed one morning in the kitchen, her body trembling violently before going still. The town doctor, tired, underpaid, and working with outdated equipment, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, waited only a moment, then closed his eyes. She's gone. The family wept. In those years, death was accepted quickly. There was no second opinion, no modern machines to double-check. Mary's body was washed, dressed in her favorite pale blue Sunday dress, and placed in a simple pine coffin. The funeral was scheduled for the very next day. The church was full. Neighbors packed into the pews, whispering about the tragedy of such a young life cut short. Candles flickered, casting long shadows against the stained glass windows. Her parents sat in the front row, faces hollow with grief. And then, just as the minister began the final prayer, the coffin moved. At first it was subtle, a slight shift. The guests thought their eyes were playing tricks. But then came a sound no one could deny, a soft gasp. The lid rattled. Murmurs filled the church. The minister froze mid-sentence. Suddenly, with a sharp creak, the coffin lid swung open. Mary sat up. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes wide in confusion, her lips trembling. "Mama," she whispered, voice raw and broken. The church erupted into screams. Some fainted, others fled the building in terror. Her mother rushed forward, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching Mary's hands. Her father fell to his knees, thanking God. For one miraculous moment, it seemed as though a nightmare had turned into a blessing. But blessings can rot into curses. Mary tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Her skin was pale as ash, her breath shallow and uneven. She clutched at her throat, her eyes rolling back. And just as suddenly as she had returned, she collapsed again into the coffin. Her chest stopped moving. Her hand slipped from her mother's grasp. The doctor rushed forward, checked her pulse, and whispered with shaking lips, "She's gone, truly gone this time." But no one believed him. The entire congregation had witnessed her awaken, speak, breathe. They had seen her alive, and now she was being declared dead all over again. Panic and paranoia spread. Whispers of curses, demons, and restless spirits filled the town. Terrified, the family insisted she be buried immediately, before she could rise once more. That very night, under torchlight, Mary Turner was lowered into the earth. Dirt covered the coffin quickly. Prayers rushed, faces pale with fear instead of grief. Yet the horror wasn't over. Neighbors living near the cemetery swore they heard something chilling in the hours after her burial, muffled cries, fists pounding desperately against wood, and the faint, heart-shattering voice of a young girl calling, "Mama, let me out." The townspeople avoided the graveyard after dark. Parents warned their children never to speak Mary's name at night. Some claimed that if you walked by her grave under a full moon, you could hear scratching beneath the soil. Mary Turner became a legend whispered in Ohio. For decades, the girl who died twice. Georgia, 1942. The cemetery lay on the outskirts of a sleepy town, surrounded by dense pine forests. The graves were old, weathered, and tilted at strange angles. Moss covered the tombstones like a thick, green carpet, and the wind carried an eerie rustle that sounded almost like whispers. Locals avoided it after sunset, claiming that the dead sometimes made noises of their own. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, strange sounds began to echo across the cemetery. At first, it was subtle, faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then came a muffled groan, almost human, followed by what could only be described as screaming. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly caretaker, had been closing the gates when she froze. Her lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the cracked gravestones. The screaming grew louder, closer, and she realized with terror that it was coming from multiple graves, not just one, but several, as if the dead were awake and crying out in desperation. By midnight, the entire town had heard. Families pressed against their doors, terrified of what they might see if they ventured outside. A group of brave or foolish men, armed with lanterns and shovels, decided to investigate. They reached the graves where the sounds were loudest. What they found would haunt them forever. Several coffins had been disturbed from the inside. Wooden lids were cracked, nails bent and twisted. Inside, the bodies were grotesquely contorted, arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. Faces were frozen in terror, mouths open in screams that could never escape. One man, Thomas Hill, nearly fainted as he saw deep claw marks on the insides of the coffins. They were alive. He gasped, realizing the truth. They were buried alive, and no one helped them. The townspeople tried to bury the horror quickly. The disturbed coffins were resealed, and the cemetery was left in silence. But the screaming didn't stop entirely. On windless nights, visitors swore they could still hear it. Faint scratching, muffled cries, and the desperate sound of bodies struggling beneath the earth. Children were warned never to wander there alone. Farmers avoided the area after sunset. The cemetery became a place of dread, known simply as the Screaming Cemetery. Locals say that the voices are not just echoes of the past, they are warnings. Those who hear the cries too clearly sometimes vanish, leaving only the memory of frantic screams and empty, disturbed graves behind. Even decades later, the cemetery remains. The tombstones lean, the soil is uneven, and at night, the scratching can still be heard if you listen closely. And some swear they see shadows moving beneath the ground, as though the dead are still trying, even now, to escape. Pennsylvania, 1905. The small town of Millersburg prided itself on its quiet streets and orderly lives. But beneath the calm lay a cemetery that carried a sinister reputation. For years, locals whispered about graves that were disturbed, coffins that shifted, and strange noises that echoed through the foggy nights. It all began with Henry Caldwell, a respected carpenter known for his meticulous work and gentle nature. One harsh winter, Henry fell ill with a sudden fever. The town doctor, overworked and distracted, declared him dead after only a brief examination. Henry's family was devastated, but the coffin was prepared quickly. The casket, of finely crafted oak, was lowered into a freshly dug grave on a fog-choked morning. Days passed. The town went about its business, but the Caldwell family began noticing something strange. Visitors to the cemetery reported hearing thumps from Henry's grave, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone pounding from the inside. At first, the family dismissed it as imagination or the settling of soil. But when the sounds intensified, they could no longer ignore it. Late one evening, Henry's son, Samuel, decided to check the grave personally. Armed with lanterns and a crowbar, He approached the earth and knelt beside the coffin. Then it happened. The coffin shook violently, rattling as if a desperate hand was slamming against its lid. Samuel stumbled back in horror as the lid cracked, a faint, muffled voice emerging from beneath the heavy wood. "Help! Me!" The town awoke to Samuel's frantic screams. Together, a group of men began to dig. The soil gave way slowly, each shovelful revealing the horrifying truth. Inside, Henry's body was contorted, his hands raw and bloody from clawing the lid. His chest bore bruises from pounding against the wood. His eyes were open, frozen in terror, mouth half open in a silent scream that had been trapped for days. Medical examination confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Henry Caldwell had woken in his coffin, struggling desperately for air. By the time the grave was opened, he had died again, exhausted and suffocated. The story spread quickly, instilling a paralyzing fear across the town. People avoided the cemetery at night. Children refused to walk by the Caldwell plot, and some claimed that even years later, if you passed the grave at midnight, the coffin would shudder as if the dead man were still trying to escape. Local legend declared the Caldwell coffin cursed. Gravediggers refused work in that section. Visitors reported hearing muffled pounding from beneath the earth, faint whispers calling for help. The town learned a chilling truth. Even the dead are not always at peace, and sometimes they fight to live long after the soil has claimed them. Maine, 1967. The sea whipped against the cliffs, carrying a cold, briny wind that cut through the small town of Harrow's Point. The cemetery there had always been notorious not for ghosts or legends, but for something far darker. The countless accounts of the living buried by mistake. Families whispered about safety coffins, hasty burials, and the screams that had haunted the cliffs for decades. It all began with Eleanor Whitmore, a young woman known for her fiery spirit and laughter that could fill a room. One bitter February, she fell suddenly ill with a mysterious fever. The local doctor, overwhelmed with patients during a harsh winter, pronounced her dead. Her parents, heartbroken but trusting, prepared a private burial in the cliffside cemetery. They chose a coffin designed with the new safety features, an internal bell, and a thin rope threaded through to the surface. It was supposed to guarantee peace of mind, but as the heavy lid was sealed, Eleanor stirred. Inside the coffin, the air was suffocating. Panic overtook her as she realized she could barely move. Her fingers clawed at the wooden walls, nails breaking against the polished oak. She hit the small bell repeatedly, a frantic rhythm of desperation. But the winter storm had knocked out the town's electricity, and no one heard it. Hours stretched like eternities. Her breaths were shallow, ragged, and cold. Above ground, the wind howled. The cemetery was silent, save for the crashing waves and the groaning of old trees. No one could know the horror unfolding below. By dawn, Eleanor had stopped moving. The bell lay still, her desperate struggle etched into the inside of the coffin. The dirt above remained untouched for days, until curious workers came to tend the graves. When they opened the coffin, they were met with a scene that would haunt every one of them forever. Her body was contorted, arms reaching toward the lid, fingers raw and bloody. Her face was frozen in sheer terror, mouth open in a silent scream. Every mark inside the coffin told a story of a final, futile battle for life. Eleanor had awakened to her grave, fought, and died again trapped in the ultimate nightmare. The town never spoke of Eleanor Whitmore again. Her parents moved away, haunted by the knowledge that their daughter had suffered alone in the dark. Locals whisper that on stormy nights, when the wind carries a certain keening sound across the cliffs, you can hear her voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me out. Let me live." The cliffside cemetery remains, a monument to the terror of being buried alive, and the stories of the Duval screams, the bride in her grave, the coffins that shook live on in whispered warnings, that death is not always final, and that sometimes the dead are screaming beneath our feet. still fighting for one last breath. Those were 10 of the most terrifying true stories of people waking up in their own graves. Can you imagine the fear, the desperation, the struggle for every single breath? If these stories sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit the like button to show your bravery. Share your thoughts or any stories you've heard in the comments. We want to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another chilling tale. Remember, the dead may be silent, but their stories will haunt you forever.